Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining our AIHEC Health webinar. Today, we're talking about mental health and Indigenous craft, and we're joined by three esteemed panelists. I'm going to post their biographies in the chat since we don't want to take up any time with the discussion today, but I will introduce them. We have Reno Charette, Amber Morceau, and Danielle Greendeer. So I'm going to start the conversation with a prompt, and this may eventually just turn into the three of them talking and sharing their wisdom and me hanging back. But could the three of you each share a bit about your background, your connection to Indigenous craft, and maybe your work with AIHEC as well?
Well, I'm unmuted. I guess I'll go first. I'm the Health Initiatives Director at AIHEC, and I live in Billings. I'm a Crow tribal member, and my background and connection to Native crafts started when I was about 8 years old. One of my mother's friends decided that she would help me be a powwow dancer and started helping me with regalia. Another aunt helped me learn how to make a simple tea dress. And as I got older, I just kept adding more types of clothing that I could make on the sewing machine, and did some beadwork. But then I went to college for like a super long time and didn't have the room in my life to do really big pieces. So I started beading clothes. And I really enjoy that. So it's just been an evolution and learning from other tribes, other women that I come in connection with. So that's my story.
Amber?
Thank you much. Ani everyone, Amber Morceau Indigenous Mishike and Doda and Bodawarami and Dao Pokaganek and Dabandagwas. Hello everyone, my name is Amber Morceau. I am the Indigenous Institutional Transformation Specialist with AIHEC. I'm a Pokagan band citizen of the Potawatomi Nation. And my background with beadwork, so I started when I was about 15 years old. So my mom actually taught me how to do beadwork, who learned it from my grandmother. And so, you know, beadwork has always kind of been something that has stayed with me through all different stages of my life, and has gotten me through some of the best times and then also some of the not so greatest times. It's definitely been something that has grounded me in all of those transitions. And so one of the ways that I really like to keep that going, or be able to share that with other folks, is especially with students, right? And so, you know, one of the things that I really like to bring to a space, especially throughout my career, starting as like a recruitment coordinator and kind of bringing students into the early stages of college, and, you know, I hate to say taking them away from home, but bringing them from their home space and trying to maintain some of those cultural connections has been through feeling that connection through creating something beautiful that is also significance in their first year of college. And so creating keychains for their first dorm room keys, you know, that's something that's really exciting, and that's something that they'll always be able to remember and something that they can carry with them. And then growing along with students and kind of doing this very investigative work in finding those cultural connections to STEM. And so being able to kind of progress through that way and share my knowledge, but also learn from my students, has been a way for me to be able to continue that good stewardship. So much so that I'm always teaching and learning folks about the different materials that we use in our beadwork, and how climate change has kind of been impacting that, and how we as good relatives can continue to share that story, and the understanding and the greater understanding of how impactful craft is to creating these good relationships with the relatives that provide us these beautiful materials to be able to do that craft with. So Chimigwach, thank you for having me today.
I'll go ahead. So good afternoon, everybody. My name is Danielle Hill Greendeer, and I'm enrolled Mashpee Wampanoag from Massachusetts. My position with AIHEC is the Food Sovereignty Program Specialist. I just began this position in February, so it is new to me, but I'm really excited to work with the TCUs. Helping them develop their food sovereignty programs. I have been walking a food sovereignty and an art path now simultaneously for maybe, since coming out of graduate school in 2008. And many times I just wondered when and how they would intersect. But I realized in sort of interesting and fun ways that they are very related. And growing up, I was always interested in traditional weaving and plant fibers and like wool. I love wool, and I just love, using my hands and my fingers and just holding tension and releasing tension in my hands and making beautiful things. So I've always gravitated towards natural fibers and plants and weaving. So I weave bags and baskets and our sashes for our regalias. And most recently, I've been playing around with naturally dyeing our corn husks and weaving corn husk bags. And sort of doing research into sort of what happened to our corn husk bags and, how come sort of no one's picking that back up again. So I've finally reached a point where like my food sovereignty work is, bleeding over into my art world, and they don't feel as separate. So the corn that I grow, it's a Wampanoag corn, I'm now using to then weave our bags and some just pretty adornment with the corn husks. I'm also very interested in natural dyes, always playing around with, how I can replace synthetic color with natural color, and, the mordanting process, and just like having fun with all that. So I'm really excited to be here with you today, and I look forward to sort of telling you more about that journey. Thank you.
Thank you, panelists. What role do traditional crafts play in preserving cultural heritage and passing down knowledge from generation to generation? Amber talked a bit about this, but let's have everybody chime in about that specifically.
Okay, I'll go first. I think traditional crafts really identify who we are as a sovereign, distinct nation. As a Crow woman, I think when we dance, we are easily identified as being Crow women because of the iconic nature of our elk tooth dresses. It's a source of pride. It strongly says who you belong to. And often those dresses are gifted from an aunt or one of your other relatives give you your first one. That's how I got mine, was through a gift, but also with it, the teaching of how you take care of it, how you take care of your regalia, perhaps some of the items that you're wearing with your regalia when you're fully dressed. I was taught that just because you like something that somebody else has on their dance regalia, that you do not have the right to copy it unless they give you that right. So for the most part, that remains to be a very serious situation among dancers, and those of us that are mixed tribes, we might have elements from our multicultural background, and others sometimes might ask you about that, why you have a certain thing. And I think it's pretty cool that we're multicultural. and have borrowed from each other. That's probably one of the silver linings that came out of the forced boarding school era, and also a result of how we're employed, mostly in BIA, IHS, going to college. All those things cause us to come across people of other tribes. That's certainly how my grandparents met each other and how my parents met each other. So it explains how my grandchildren are of 7 different tribes. It's through that meeting other tribal people and sharing in what we know. So I think our designs on our beadwork might also have belonged to an ancestor, and that we hand those designs down. So that's another reason that you can't copy someone else's beadwork. If you're on Facebook for even 10 minutes and reading posts by other natives, you'll see that come up from time to time, that I'm only posting this, like I'm proud of it. I made this. Please don't copy my designs. And we have to adhere to that. Being able to make regalia, do beadwork and dance and cook traditional foods and participate in ceremonies, speaking the language are all ways of expressing our cultural identity. And I'm still practicing. I'm 67 and I'm still practicing all of that. Thank you.
Let me go ahead, Reno. So, from my story and my perspective, I think that being able to preserve that cultural heritage goes back to really what Reno was saying is, we lost a lot of knowledge during that boarding school era, right? And there was certain knowledges that had to be protected and passed down through those generations. So, in my story, my mom who learned from my grandmother, and my grandmother who learned from my great grandmother. My great grandmother was in the boarding schools, and thankfully she was able to pass that knowledge down to my non-native grandmother, who then passed that knowledge down to my non-native mother. And so that kind of came back full circle in my mom teaching me. And it, I didn't really realize it at the time when I first started learning beadwork. It was just kind of an activity for me to keep myself grounded and stay out of trouble a little bit at 15. But it really became something that I was very passionate about. And, even with those seeds that were sown by non-native women that I had learned from, it actually reconnected me to my roots and became something that I was so passionate about that I started doing a little bit more investigative inquiry, right? So what are these symbols that are so specific to our woodlands tribes, learning about our florals and our daisies. And then that kind of had a domino effect to, okay, what tribes are using which specific florals? And, what is the significance of these medicines that we model our beadwork after? How do we preserve some of these relatives so we can continue to tell these stories, right? And so, being able to preserve that cultural knowledge is also being able to expand that cultural knowledge. I started with something that was just as small as a little bead, but I got to work into that and bring in more of those different elements. And now I'm able to share all of the knowledge that I have with the students that I teach. Like, this isn't just something beautiful that we're making with our hands here. This is a piece of history, and this is a piece of knowledge that we get to honor and share the stories of other people or other non-human relatives, and being able to honor them in a good way. And being able to do so is speaking a lot to the resilience that we have really carried with us throughout all of these different trials and tribulations that history has kind of thrown at us, despite, colonization and forced assimilation and erasure of our cultural narratives. These are ways that we can bring them back, and being able to share in that space, and ways that we can honor, like I said, those non-human relatives and being able to be their voice, right? The more that we learn about it and the more that we use these materials. And I'm really interested to hear a little bit more from Danielle about her investigative work in rematriating some of those traditional dyes and some of those crafts. You know, even going into quill working, right? You know, beads are something that came with colonization. Quill working is something that we had before then. And so being able to explore all of these different areas of our cultural craft is actually an act of resilience and an act of rematriation to be able to reclaim that knowledge and continue to steward it forward in a good way.
Yeah, it's definitely well said, both Reno and Amber. When it comes to identity, I definitely agree. It's clear that the symbolism is, you know, tribe specific, and you see that on regalias, but also when it comes to the mediums that we're using, that's also regionally specific. So for us, like our clay pots, our clay comes from our oceans and it's a particular color, and that's going to vary from region to region. Our symbols are more fluid and represent water because we are being, you know, we're water beings. And so we're sort of visually representing sort of what's around us and branding ourselves, if you will. And the thing I love about identity and art is that, you know, art and craft is like what remains. And just as a human species, we're so fascinated with it. Like we're so fascinated with collecting pieces and remnants of our art and preserving it over time, because it's also our beauty that we're like preserving too. And it's there's just something so special about, you know, something handmade and handcrafted being passed on from just person to person, because it's personal. It's a part of yourself, you know. It's a part of you, and it's the part that I often have issues with is like the commodification of that. And I opened up an art gallery in 2020 called the Wampanoag Trading Post and Gallery, and that was in Massachusetts. And the reason why I opened it was because we didn't have any representation in our own homelands. It was constantly being encroached upon by developers and non-natives. And, you know, many folks moving to Cape Cod and to Mashpee had no idea that there was a Native American Wampanoag population, you know, and like, this is our land. And so I created the space for everyone to not only show off, you know, like, this is what I make, and then help create that healthy competition and healthy sort of internal economy with our artists and our crafters, but also to give folks, native and non-native, access to our art, to be able to buy it, purchase it, and support it. But the other part was like, you know, some of these things are just special to us. And do we really want to sell like our wampum, you know, to non-natives, you know, or do we want to sell it to ourselves, or just our trade rather, you know, or barter amongst ourselves? Like, why do we want to, you know, receive money from it? So there's just all these conflicting elements to it. You know, you got to take the good with the bad, but it's really important for us to continue to just identify ourselves and evolve that identity as well with the times. Something that, you know, we could probably touch upon later in the conversation is like, is our art evolving? You know, is our identity evolving? Are we coming up with new symbolisms or new symbols and new representations of ourselves in this modern day? Or are we, you know, recreating, you know, the past just with new mediums? So yeah, it's just a lot, but it's important. And I think that tribes today are doing a really good job with at least combating things like cultural appropriation and folks trying to steal our cultural expression and our identity. I think that's always something that we're battling, but I think we're doing a good job at claiming what is rightfully ours.
You. You've all talked a bit about, or at least touched on, the boarding schools and how practicing in craft is an important part of maybe revitalizing or carrying on traditions that were lost or forgotten during that period. But I'm wondering if you can all talk both on a personal level and a community level about how engaging in craft is beneficial for mental health as a person, and healing or the mental health and the well-being of a community.
Well, I can start. For my personal mental health, I use my arts and crafts to keep me balanced in my day. In running the programs that I do for AIHEC, a lot of it involves very detailed work of spreadsheets and cross-referencing across all the grants that I'm running, that I've got my staff moving forward. So it can get really down to little tiny things. And in order to help my energy stay up, I simultaneously will have an art project going. So when I'm not working, I'm engaged in art. And even though beadwork can also be the management of really tiny things, what's going on with me is the repetition of the steps, the threading and the counting of the needles and the color, and just enjoying the journey. Whichever step I'm at and creating a piece, I have to enjoy that particular step, and that it sustains me and refills my cup. So when I'm going back to my job, I feel like I'm bringing more back the next day instead of being drained. So I kind of learned that the hard way when I was in graduate school, and it seemed like I went from being a straight A undergraduate to being a graduate student that all the teachers thought I couldn't do nothing right. And I would work out until I cried, and that didn't seem to help. But what helped me was to sit down and do beadwork. And that was calming, and it grounded me that I am a strong Native woman and that I can take on bigger things. So I've used it in that fashion. And it was also something I used in my classrooms. I would teach students various things. Sometimes I get into trouble, but I'll tell you a crazy story. Don't know if y'all can see this little bag. See the beading around the edge? It gets blurry. That's what's holding this all together. At one point, it was all one long strip, rectangle strip of buckskin. And we folded one end up and we secured it by beading an edge work all the way around. That's simple. You don't have to do too much for it. You don't even have to bead the string. You could just make it a buckskin string. So when I worked in the School of Pharmacy, I had my students make those as a medicine, because typically they're a medicine bag. But I wanted to put a spin on it from a pharmacy point of view. So I gave them each a condom to measure, to make the bag fit the condom. And then if they wanted to get really fancy, they could use 2 condoms so that they might make a bag big enough so it would hold 2. Students had a great time doing it, talking and visiting just as it was in the old days, and with my relatives when they would get together and bead. Lots of visiting and joking, and it was wonderful, and they produced these really nice looking bags. So then it was a 6-week summer program. So after that, the students would go up to each other and squeeze their bag. So you know what it feels like when you squeeze an empty bag. So students would say to one another, because I love you, I'm going to fill your bag. This was in the time of when AIDS was still really a threat to our population. So they would fill each other's bag as an act of love for one another. And I was really proud of myself. I was proud of my students. But some of my students were still in high school. And I did not have signed consent forms from their parents for them to learn about contraception. So the dean of my school said, you got to keep that one on the down low. But the kids ended going home wearing the bags, and not one parent has ever stopped me and say, hey, I remember what you did. My kid was only 16, you know. So I survived that one. But as far as the mental health, I like the way that it grounds me, like how it grounds Amber. It also grounds me. But it can also be a blessing when you love somebody. It's not just about mental health in the bad way when you're troubled and things aren't going well. It's also about mental health for a good way. So when my daughters have had babies, it's been my right and my privilege and honor to bead the bags that are my grandbabies' belly buttons go in. I don't have one to show you because it's our way that child has to take that belly button with them, and we put it at the back of our neck when we are in our regalia. And for children whose family did not keep their belly button, the grandmas will tell you, they'll spot those kids easily, and they'll say, those kids that dig in all the drawers and they're in your closets and in your cupboards, and they're always getting into everything. And the grandmas will say, I bet he's looking for his belly button. He needs to know where he belongs. And so that making that is a blessing to my grandchildren, so that they always know who they belong to and where they belong. So those are.
Amber, Danielle, want to chime in on craft as a personal mental health exercise as well as a community healing exercise?
I can just add to the personal. For me, crafting is almost like a shield against any like negative thoughts or any sort of, you know, negative feelings that I'm having or things that are going on. And I can see it in my work if it's still like affecting me. You know, like I can tell when my work is off. I can feel it. And I don't like to use the word perfectionist because it sounds, you know, has like a sort of a negative connotation, but I like to have my work be consistent. And when it comes to weaving, like having like my straight rows and my straight lines, like I believe in the order of my work, and I believe in symmetry because I see it, you know, within nature, and that's something that I gravitate towards. So when I craft and I'm making something, I make sure that I either have silence or I have like just I just have like instrumental music or flute music, just something without words. So that way it's like a feeling that I'm trying to embody, like a feeling of bliss that I'm trying to sort of, you know, transfer over to whatever it is that I'm creating. And I think that's the mental health aspect. And someone had asked about like, is there research? And I'm not quite sure if there is research, but I think that if you just craft, like you'll find out. Like you'll find out like the benefits, because a lot of people, like, things surface up, it's like frustration or impatience. Like it's like those things that like you have to kind of work to keep at bay, or like just kind of iron out within yourself. Because I can, it took me a long time to build that stamina too. Like I can now sit for hours. I want to sit for hours and like in silence, and and just do my craft, and know that I'm creating something beautiful, and that makes me feel good, and that has positive health effects on my mental well-being, and it just allows my mind to rest, where I don't have to think about anything or what I'm going to do next. And it's funny because the motivator to create my next piece, anytime I've started something, all of a sudden all the ideas rush through on my next pieces. And I'm like, oh my God, I have to hurry up and finish and get this one done so I can start the next one. And it's like, for me, if I were just to like be doing something else, rarely does like an idea pop into my mind, like, oh, you should weave this or you should make that. It's only when I'm creating something. It's like I've opened up that door, that portal where it's like, okay, you're walking through it, like here's all the other things you need to make. And so that's my motivator to keep going and to want to finish it as well. So yeah, that's what I have to add.
Yeah, for very similar reasons, as Danielle has had, beadwork for me is something, like I said, it's something that's always kept me grounded. It the work that we do every day, right? The noise gets so loud and the burden gets so heavy sometimes, especially when you're doing heart work. Like we do here at AIHEC, something that's very salient to us and that's very important to our communities. And that can weigh on us quite a bit, right? Because we want to do our best and we put 150% in all the time every day and going, and taking on all of these different projects and, kind of feeling on that responsibility. And, beadwork is kind of a responsibility to myself and my mental health, in that I am taking that time to slow down and just be very intentional and to empty my mind of all of the thoughts that are happening around me and all the responsibilities. And the only responsibility that I have in that moment is to myself and working on this piece, right? And that might be a piece that I give away, or a piece that I give to somebody else, as a labor of love. But really, kind of taking that time just for myself to reconnect with myself and think about, why am I doing this, and what is the significance of this, and it's not for anybody else in that moment other than me, because I just need the space to just unload and and just be, doing this thing that is very repetitive and very calming and very meticulous. And it's something at the end of my session, no matter how far or how unfinished it is, I can say I made progress on something today. I got something done today and it made me feel really good. Um, and so, being able to just create that space, even if you're doing it in meetings, like one of the things that I love to do is bead during meetings. I love crafting during meetings. And there is actually a book about that by a former faculty, TCU faculty member, Linda Black Elk. She did a little bit of research on this, that doing beadwork while you're doing meetings is actually helpful in the retention of knowledge. And so it's another mental health piece for me, because I am focusing on this thing, but I'm also retaining the knowledge that I'm learning from other people. I wouldn't recommend necessarily doing it in a meeting where you do have to take notes, because you may miss some of those things, but being able to slow your mind down in one aspect and also be attuned to what you're listening to, helps, especially when you're in those high energy, high anxiety meetings. It's something that's there to ground you and to help you be able to create that space to retain knowledge, that otherwise, if you're in that high anxiety and you're hyper focused on this one meeting, you might not be able to have. So that's one of the ways that that's kind of helped me. And then, as a community member, this is, it helps contribute, especially if you share this craft and your skills with other folks, it helps them find other tools for grounding, and that's significant for them, or even makes them feel a little bit more at home. So when I was doing these workshops with our incoming students as a part of our freshman first year experience, um, where students were kind of leaving their communities and joining the college community, beadwork was a way for them to feel connected to their relatives back at home, because this is a piece of culture that they could bring with them everywhere they went. Because you got to bring your keys with you no matter where you go, right? And it was something that they would be able to work on together, as a community. So building community through beadwork, being able to string these beads together, being able to say, hey, I got this knot over here. Can you help undo this for me? Right. Or, hey, I like that color you got going on over there. Can I have some of that? Or, hey, I like your pattern. Can you show me how you did that? And I'll use these colors that are significant to me. But being able to tell a story a little bit in that and be able to create those community connections and knowing that you're sharing space with one another is something that I have found a lot of value in being able to teach my students about mental health, is that, no matter where you go, you'll always have a piece of your community with you. And this is something that you can do in a community setting when you need that person to person interaction.
Curious about the intersection between this practice of doing craft and other practices from your communities and your cultures that you use either for physical or spiritual or mental well-being. So maybe not specifically craft work, but other practices that you incorporate into your life.
Well, I'm glad you brought that up, because for what I lack in doing big pieces of beadwork, I make up for in learning, knowing, and sharing how to make traditional foods. And even though I live in an urban community, I travel to neighboring tribal communities. I have been the camp cook for Sundances, providing meals for the sings that lead up to a Sundance, cooking for sweat lodge ceremonies. I even did a presentation at the university where I worked at on food sovereignty. So Danielle and I have cause to have a conversation. And I talked about food sovereignty for natives, the traditional trade networks and stuff. And then I made traditional food for 200 people. And my crew that was supposed to help me all had childcare issues, exam issues, transportation issues. So I ended up in the kitchen cooking food all day for 200 people, then doing my presentation. So I had to learn my lesson on that one. But I've also done cooking demonstration on Michif food from the Turtle Mountain Chippewa at a Métis music festival, and that was a big hit. All the people that came to my cooking demonstration, cooking on a campfire, sampled the rabbit soup that I made with the rubaboo, and I made gullet on the campfire as well. So I enjoy the preparation of food and the presentation of food, and see it as a way to really nourish people. When my eldest son graduated from the journalism school, we gave him a party that was very traditional. He got his Crow Indian name, and we fed our clan members. And I made pemmican, and it was hard to get all the ingredients, so I didn't have enough for everybody, but I had enough for all the men, so that they would pray for my son and his well-being as he stepped out into the world as a new graduate. And for some, it made them cry, because it had been so long since they had eaten pemmican balls, and it's a porridge that we make out of wild prairie turnips. And I find that food does that. It connects you back. I have a friend who's from Rocky Boy, and he lost his mother, and I made bannock for him, and it made him cry because it reminded him of his mother. So I think food should also be in this category of crafting in a traditional way.
So I definitely, you know, in the spirit of kind of trading knowledge, right? Like I share beadwork with folks, um, and they're able to share their traditional plant knowledge with me, or I just gift it to them, right? Like if somebody shares something with me, I can share a piece of myself by sharing, you know, earrings that I have on hand, or, you know, making something very specific to them, or, um, you know, I've even gotten into working with birch bark, right? Being able to experiment and kind of try different things that would make folks happy. And so, you know, in the spirit of food sovereignty, like making things out of other materials and just kind of trying to get real creative out of it. So I make a pair of beaded earrings that have little corn husk tassels on them, right? To kind of work in that piece that's really salient to other folks. You know, I usually give those to folks that share traditional food knowledge with me. Or, you know, one of my students, she said, "Hey, we're going to go leaking and we're going to go talk some language over here one day." And I'm like, "Oh, okay, great." So, you know, she took me out leaking and she was teaching me all about the treaty rights, because in the place that I live right now, it's not my traditional homelands. We're a little bit further north. And so we have two treaties that are divided by the river that's up here. And so, you know, her and my joke is, "Oh, is it your treaty rights or mine?" Right? Kind of flip-flopping between that river line. And so being able to exchange that cultural knowledge, and that reciprocity and that gift in itself, is something that I really do enjoy engaging in, um, because that cultural exchange, that knowledge exchange is so invaluable, right? Being able to learn a little bit about the folks that surround you, and what makes them interested in the work that they do. Language, you know, is something that we're losing every day. And so when I can share a piece of beadwork with somebody that shares a little bit of language with me, I don't think that beadwork piece is big enough, because they're giving me the gift of something that you don't necessarily write down on paper, or something you can't make with your hands. And so, just being able to share those pieces of ourselves with our community members, and have that, in that spirit of reciprocity, and being able to do things in a good way and the right way, um, is, you know, something I like to engage in outside of doing beadwork itself.
I too also gravitate towards my traditional foodways, sort of being on the East Coast on the water. We typically say, you know, if there's anything bothering you, if you need clarity, or, you know, if you just need to connect or reconnect, you know, just take it to the water. So usually like fishing, shell fishing, you know, clamming, quahogging, like all those things in the bay and the salt water, that's really healing for me and many of us who are, you know, Wampanoag and on the East Coast. And it's also just preserving our traditional, you know, Aboriginal hunting and fishing rights too, and just exercising that, and being present in the water, not necessarily for any sort of commodification of anything, but just reconnecting. And then usually those quahogs that, you know, I collect, you know, we'll make into wampum, and just spend time with that animal and that being, you know, to nourish me on a physical level, and then, you know, working with it to create it into something beautiful is helping, you know, my mental health and my spiritual health. So the other thing too is dance. Reno mentioned it earlier, just with regalia, but, powwow is, it's not necessarily ceremonial, but, whatever you're bringing to the circle can be. So dancing it out and, just connecting with the drum is also something that helps me with, and many of us, of course, with our sobriety, with our mental health, our physical health, our spiritual health, like that is also what identifies us and unifies us from just different cultures. So I think it's all related, of course, our foodways, our crafts, our powwow, and our just our art is like one and the same. We're all sort of just trying to strengthen that our spiritual connectedness, and it's all related. So
thank you. This will be our last panel question, and then we'll take some time for questions from the attendees today. But if someone is here and they're interested in beginning crafting, they've maybe never engaged in that part of their Indigenous culture, how would you recommend that they get connected or get some knowledge to get started?
I'll start with that. But I want to preface my remarks by saying that for the Plains, the Great Plains tribes, it was the work of women to manufacture our clothing. The men made other items, but women were in charge of our clothing. So all through history, as the materials have changed, our exposure to other cultures has increased, the style of our clothing shows some of that change. But at some point, the women said, this is it. This is how we're going to look. The wool that is the base for my elk-tooth dress is not Indigenous made, but it continues to be the icon of who I am as a Crow woman. So I just want to say that women use our skills in crafting and art in ways of protecting our people that expand out to being activists. And one way that I've seen that grow and develop is in the adoption of ribbon skirts. Ribbon skirts, especially red ones, is a symbol of the missing and murdered Indigenous people movement across the country and Canada. And women teach each other how to do these things. I had lessons when I was a professor at Montana State University to teach the women of my community how to make ribbon skirts. And the ribbon skirts are intended to remind us that we are beings of the earth and that we have to care for the earth and that we have this interconnected relationship with the earth. And in that relationship, we are very strong people. So we have the strength within us to stand up against the missing and murdered Indigenous problem in our country and make a change. And so we gift that to each other. We make them for our babies, and they're sources of great pride. You can learn to make those on YouTube. Just Google ribbon skirts, and you'll find many videos that teach you how to do that. You can also connect with any organization that's related or working on missing and murdered Indigenous efforts and find women and men that sew and can teach you how to make a ribbon skirt. So that's my contribution at this point.
I would say that if someone is interested in, in exploring native craft or wanting to make something, I would hope that they themselves are of Indigenous or Native descent. I personally don't think that non-natives should be making craft or native art if they're not like married into the culture or don't have, children who are in the culture. I personally don't support Native inspired art. I think that, Native American art is sacred, and you can admire it, but I don't think that you should try to replicate it if you don't have ties to a community or are of Native descent. And that's my personal opinion. And the Native Arts and Crafts Act also protects, art being sold from non-natives who are trying to sort of market it as being Native. But if you are Native.
Hi, this is
and-
Dr. William. Excuse me. This is Dr.
Well,
Williams.
I
How
would
are you
like
today?
I would like to finish my statement, but
And
if-
after you're done, I'd just like to make a comment. I'm asking your permission after you're done. So,
Yeah, so Danielle, if you want to go ahead and finish, and then we'll open it up for questions once Danielle and Amber have had time to share.
Thank you. So if you are Native and you are looking to, get into the craft, I would personally recommend, first of all, just like finding out the folks within your community that may be making what it is you're trying to create, and asking them, to help to teach you essentially. I think just out of respect, when it comes to craft, like folks spend a lot of time learning and relearning and even teaching themselves, and would be honored to teach someone else, and also create those, connections. So yeah, as Tammy said, finding the culture bearers in your community. And also sometimes that there are rules sometimes within different cultures around creating certain things, and the process and how to do something culturally correct in your own tribal context. So like when you just recreate something, you're like, oh, I can make that. And then you do without asking like permission or asking the folks who are the knowledge bearers on that. Sometimes that could be seen disrespectful. Like, for example, in certain cultures, like, only men are supposed to make the drums, for example, or, so it's like, if you're just like, oh, I wanted to make a drum and sing and learn how to sing, so I made one myself, like that could be seen as disrespectful. And especially if you're going out to like use that drum to sing in public spaces or what have you. So I think that there are protocols that you just have to double check on. So anyways, that's just all I had to say. I was kind of thrown off. Yeah, so thank you.
Thank you. We'll move to Amber, and then Dr. Williams can ask her question after Amber's comments.
Thank you much. So I would definitely say going and finding those culture bearers first, right? Being able to learn this craft in a good way, and finding out what that really means, from that cultural context and from somebody who has that very strong connection to that work. As somebody who has learned this skill that is very salient to me, from non-Indigenous women, but that they had learned that skill from my great grandmother. Those are teachings that it was a foundational skill, right? So my grandmother was married to my grandfather who was Indigenous, and then my mother was married to my father who was Indigenous. And so this was a tradition that was passed down by the women in my family, and learning that craft in a good way, right? But that's not something that they would necessarily have shared with their non-Indigenous children, or their non-Indigenous grandchildren. This is not something that they went out and said, I'm going to lead this beading circle for non-Indigenous people, right? Because that wasn't their place. Their place was to be able to learn this craft to then teach it back to folks, myself included, to do it in a good way and carry on those traditions. And so I think it's very important what Danielle was saying is that stewarding that in a good way and understanding the responsibilities that come with that knowledge is very important. And being able to obtain that knowledge in a good way and steward that in a good way has its place. Being able to honor those traditions as an Indigenous person is part of that responsibility. And as a non-Indigenous person, understanding that responsibility, that knowledge, and that's part of the responsibility, is knowing that that knowledge belongs to Indigenous people and therefore should not be sold or monetized or any other kind of exploited in a way that would be harmful to that community or to the craft itself. I've seen a lot of folks make jewelry that is absolutely beautiful and try and sell it as Indigenous crafted, but they don't know the stories behind that. They don't know what those materials mean. And so if you're not honoring those materials or that craft in a good way, it is very disrespectful. And so being able to obtain that knowledge, in a good way and in a sacred way is just as important as being able to carry on those traditions.
Thank you. Reno, Kyle is asking if it's appropriate. I don't know if you saw it, Reno, maybe.
I did. I think that he could find MMIP groups in his area and just reach out and say that you are interested in helping and work on building a good relationship with that group or other Indigenous groups in his area. Allies, like Tammy Buffalo Head says, allies are always welcome. There is a role in the activist movement. We won't be able to change the rates of missing and murdered Indigenous people unless we have all sectors of our society doing their part to make that change.
But before we wrap things up, are there any other questions for our amazing panelists today? This, I think, may warrant a round 2 of this topic. Maybe it seems like there's a lot left to explore. All right, well, thank you everyone so much.